Allora, per me è un grande onore e un'occasione straordinaria avere John Moreland qua a Siena per 2 appuntamenti. John Moreland è, per chi non lo conosce, è Reader in Medieval Archaeology dell'Università di Sheffield. Ha scavato a Montarrenti, dove ci siamo conosciuti ormai molti anni fa, 25 anni fa, quindi non siamo più di primo pelo tutti e due. Ha condotto il Farfa Survey e ha studiato l'incasellamento della Sabinia, scavando anche quel contesto ben noto nel nostro Dipartimento che è Casale San Donato. E poi ha condotto il Bradbourne Landscape Project, progetto di cui credo ci parlerà forse anche oggi. Gli interessi di ricerca di John sono essenzialmente diretti a comprendere i processi umani e storici dalla tarda antichità all'alto medioevo. In particolare negli ultimi anni ha centrato la sua attenzione sull'uso della scrittura nella società del passato come mezzo e tecnologia sia di oppressione che di potere. Credo sarà la lezione di domani. Il ruolo delle immagini nelle società medievali e moderne e sulla transizione tra tarda antichità e medioevo in Europa e particolarmente in Inghilterra e nel
From the Roman colonization, this is his reconstruction of what the Roman period settlement looked like in this valley. So he could reconstruct the settlement from the Roman period, and the Romans came looking for lead, they were looking for minerals, but also they wanted to use the valley to graze sheep. So the valley was used for lead and for sheep, mostly. So Richard reconstructed the landscape use and the settlement from the Roman period through the demise of the Roman Empire, the abandonment of the valley at the end of the Roman Empire, but then the recolonization of the valley by Cistercian monks in the 12th and 13th century. So it was first the Romans, then abandonment, and then the valley was reoccupied by the monks from the Cistercian monasteries in the 12th and 13th centuries. And they came to the valley looking for lead, and they came looking for grazing for their sheep, the same as the Romans. They wanted the minerals. One of the main excavations in the valley one of the main excavations carried out as part of the project, the Western Grange project, was the excavation of the main monastic building. I emphasize monastic. These are monastic buildings for monks, monasteries. Excavations of the main monastic buildings here. And this is Richard's reconstruction here of the main monastic building of the 12th and 13th centuries. The excavations of the Grange here allowed Richard to reconstruct a building sequence from the late 12th century to the 15th century. So he constructed a building sequence from the late 12th century to the 15th century. He was also able to present, and I'm getting to the point of the lecture now, he was also able to present a very detailed picture of everyday life, of what everyday life looked like in this valley in the 12th century, in the 13th century, and in the 14th century. In the report that Richard published, in the excavation reports, Richard tells us that the animal bone evidence, the animal bones tell us that the inhabitants of this settlement, they ate beef, but they had a big preference for lamb. So this is what we learn from the animal bone evidence. The evidence also, he says, tells us that they obtained their pottery on local markets, very locally, so there wasn't much pottery from a long distance, although some of it, which was associated with milk processing, came from a bit further away. Most production, most exchange was local to the area. a late 13th century urinal, and you see here is a monk holding a urinal. Come to this urinal in it. It's a okay. Richard says this late 13th century glass vessel suggests that some members of the household aspired to a grand style of living. So mostly it was about animal bones, mostly it's about pottery, but some people had a grand style of living. A view, he says, confirmed by the elegant gilded buckles and the catches for elegant boxes that were found as well. So in Richard's book, everyday life at Royston Grange in the 13th century is seen in terms of diet, it's seen in terms of food, it's seen in terms of culinary activities, it's seen in terms of subsistence and in terms of exchange. There is very little acknowledgement in Richard's book that this was a monastic community, that these were monks. There is no recognition that this was a community which had a firm belief in the saving power of Christ. There's no acknowledgement that the daily life of this community was structured through prayer, through liturgy of the church, through the rituals of the church. What's missing from considerations of everyday life at Royston Grange is any understanding, any acknowledgement that the ritual permeates the routine, that the mundane was permeated by the marvelous, by the miraculous. In this reconstruction of everyday life is separate from, it's devoid of, it's opposed to ritual. So there's a separation between daily life and ritual, a separation between the mundane and the marvelous, a separation between the routine and ritual. Now, when Richard left Sheffield to become director of the British School at Rome many years ago, I took his job in Sheffield, and I continued his work in this area of England, looking at the late Roman, early medieval period in the Peak District. My project, which Marco mentioned at the beginning, was on the village of Bradbourne. Is here. Now, Royston Grange, Richard's project, is here, and Bradbourne is 2 kilometres, 3 kilometres from Royston Grange. And like Royston Grange, my interest was in the late Roman to early medieval periods in this area. But I also wanted to reconstruct a history from prehistory to the present, with a very particular focus on late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. What Richard found at Royston was a gap in the archaeology, as everywhere. The gap is between the 4th century and the 8th century. You find it everywhere. We tried to fill that gap by working at Bradbourne. And we went to Bradbourne because in this village there is a cross. I'll explain much more later about this cross. There's a cross in the churchyard. This cross is dated to the late 8th century. And so we hoped that we would be able, because the cross was there, we knew someone was living there in the late 8th century. So we hoped to find evidence here. Also, very close to Bradbourne, this is Bradbourne here, just here, there is a Bronze Age, dal Età di Bronzo, a Bronze Age barrow, a tumulo. And this barrow was reused in the 7th century for burial. So this is the barrow from the Bronze Age, and in the 7th century inserted into the barrow were five bodies, 5 skeletons from the angles. So we knew that there were people living here in the 7th century. So we hoped that, and we also knew that there was Roman pottery nearby. So for all these reasons, we hoped that at Bradbourne we would find the gap between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. We didn't. We excavated for many years. We excavated many small trenches through the village. Some here, some in here, some in the church, around the church as well, but we never found any evidence for the 7th century or the 8th century. No settlement at all. But we know they were there because the cross is there, and we know there are 7th century burials in the barrow at Wigburlow. So we know they're there, but we couldn't find them. We did find pottery of the 9th century. Excavations also showed that the village was replanned in the 10th and 11th centuries, in the late Saxon, early Norman period. There was a major replanning of the village at that time, and the village was separated from the landscape by a series of earthworks. So in the late 10th, early 11th century, earthworks were constructed around the village like this. And what's interesting about Bradbourne is that after that time, the village never expanded beyond those earthworks. It always stayed within this area. So we found 9th century ceramics. We found this restructuring of the village in the late 10th, early 11th centuries. We were also able, because of some emergency work we did in this area, just here, on the edge of the village, we were able to excavate a very detailed sequence of one house. The man was building a garage for his car, and he dug through the archaeology without any worries at all. And he also was making a place for to turn his car, and he excavated through the archaeology without any problem at all. So we did some emergency work in this area, and we excavated a fantastic longhouse of the late 13th, early 14th centuries. And this was the first house of this kind excavated in this area ever. So it was good. The earliest occupation on this site would seem to belong to the 11th century, from the period when the village was replanned. But the main phase, this mid-13th century phase, consisted of this longhouse that you can see here. It would have been a wooden building set on stone footings, as you can see here, very much like the main building at Royston Grange. So very similar in time, very similar in construction. The floor of the house would have been earth or clay. We had no evidence for paving or anything like that. A series of small hearths, fornaci, a series of small hearths, but also some slag and waste products, suggest that metal was worked here. And the ceramics suggest that most of the pottery came from the region. Like Royston Grange, it was regional production. There were no products from a long way away. It was very localized. We know the site was abandoned in the 14th century, probably as a result of the Black Death, the pest, the plague. But
the village didn't contract too much. There wasn't an impact of the plague because the village never really contracted away from or expanded beyond the boundaries established in the 11th century. So, the archaeology of Bradbourne that I wrote is very similar to the archaeology of Royston Grange that Richard wrote, in the sense that we focus on subsistence, we focus on exchange, we focus on the settlement sequence. For me too, my publications on this site, there is no acknowledgement that the church, this church, lay at the heart of the village. There is no acknowledgement that the cross in the churchyard existed. There is no consideration there's no consideration of this cross. There is no consideration even of this burial mound. There's no idea that these ritual features structured the human action from day to day. The problem here is there is no archaeology of belief. No archaeology of belief. And this is the central message that I'm trying to talk about today. There is no archaeology of belief. I focus on the work of Richard and my work because I know them very well, but I also know this absence of an archaeology of belief is typical of work in England. Historical archaeologists in England are content to write about settlement sequences, they're content to write about settlement patterns, they're content to write about landscape use. They write about everyday life structured by subsistence and structured by routine. This might be true of work in Italy as well, historical archaeology in Italy as well. When I wrote this, I looked at Federico Cantini's publications of the excavations at Monterenti, because I worked there, so it's interesting. And the excavations at Monterenti, the publication of the excavations at Monterenti, are very similar to the excavations published at Royston Grange and the excavations published, my excavations, at Bradbourne. The excavations at Monterenti, the publication of the excavations at Monterenti, they also stress the sequence, the structural sequence, the subsistence evidence, and they draw conclusions about production and about exchange from the ceramic evidence. It's normal. When there is any consideration of forces that operated beyond subsistence, beyond exchange, they're usually characterized as acting upon people. These are forces that act upon individuals. They're not considered as beliefs central to people's sense of themselves, central to people's sense of themselves as part of a community. So there's a consideration of forces that operate on people, no consideration of beliefs held by people. And this is true of the excavations at Monterenti, but it's also true of most excavations published in Britain. In fact, we are not alone. We as archaeologists are not alone in writing like this. So, for example, my good friend, our good friend, Chris Wickham, in his, Chris Wickham, in his new book, Framing the Early Middle Ages, Chris wrote this book, 1,000 pages, and there is only 2 references to the church in the book. So he wrote the history of late antiquity to the early Middle Ages without any serious consideration of belief or the church. Similarly, Ferdinand Braudel, even more famous than Wickham, Braudel called the first volume of his Civilization and Capitalism, he called it The Structures of Everyday Life. And the chapters in the book on everyday life, the chapters are the weight of numbers, this is demography, daily bread, the subsistence, food and drink, subsistence, houses, clothes and fashion, the spread of technology, money, towns, and cities. These are the chapters in the structures of everyday life. These are the same kind of areas that archaeologists talk about when they talk about everyday life. Subsistence, demography, exchange, this kind of thing. Excuse me. In fact, Brodel is very explicit about how he understands everyday life is governed by subsistence and by routine. I hope you can read this. If you can't read, I'll read for you. Brodel says, of the everyday, he says, people go on sowing wheat as they always have done. They go on planting maize as they always have done. They terrace paddy fields as they always have done. It's everyday, it's repetition, it's routine, all the time. Everyday life, he says, consists of little things one hardly notices in time and space. This is what the very famous American archaeologist Jim Dietz would call the small things forgotten. And I'll talk more about that tomorrow. So everyday life consists of the little things one hardly notices in time and space. The everyday happening is repeated. It's repetition and routine. It characterizes ways of being, ways of behaving, which are perpetuated through endless time. So this is Brodel. Now, it could be argued, in fact, that this version of Annales history, and this is only one version of Annales history, but it could be argued that this version of Annales history played a very significant part in the kind of routine, the kind of mundane archaeologies of the everyday that British archaeologists produce. Because some British archaeologists were very heavily influenced, especially by Brodel, and especially by this understanding of everyday life. Just as Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, when they established the Annales School, just as they rejected l'histoire sorbonniste as obsessed with battles, with marriages, with the deaths of great men, so some archaeologists have argued that texts, the written texts, provide us with insights only into the worldview of dominant males. I'll talk more about this tomorrow. Okay. These archaeologists argue that we must reject the texts, and they argue that archaeology is much more democratic. They argue that archaeology gives us access to the reality of everyone every day. They argue that archaeology allows us to give voice to the voiceless, as they say. They argue that archaeology allows us to bring forward those absent from the texts. So they reject the texts and they focus on archaeology, but they focus on archaeology in a very particular way. One of the prime figures in British archaeology in advocating annalist archaeology was Professor Barker, Graham Barker. And so in his publication of the Befferno Valley project, Graham argued that we must use Annales history to reconstruct settlement patterns and to reconstruct settlement process. In the book, A Mediterranean Valley, Landscape Archaeology, and Annales History, Graham emphasizes the longer-term structures of the conjuncture and the longue durée. The longue durée, as you will know, for Brodel, I quote, is a history whose passage is almost imperceptible, a history in which all change is slow, a history of constant repetition, repetition again, a history of constant repetition, ever-recurring cycles. Graham concludes his book by talking about this woman on the front cover. And he says that his project is designed to tell the story of this woman. And he says it tells the story of a form of peasant life that is so old that no one knows where it came from. It is so old, it may have been here, there, forever. So again, this is repetition and routine. But if you read the book, this is also a peasant life that is devoid of belief, devoid of ritual, devoid of magic, the marvelous. Nothing occurs in this book which tells us about ritual life, about magical life of these peasants in the Bifurno Valley from prehistory to the present. And the question I ask, really, is that the reality of the historical past? Because this is the kind of historical past that we reconstruct for people in the past. And now we have some theory, very small. In fact, in the last few years, a whole range of disciplines, but particularly sociology and anthropology, have come to regard this kind of writing about the everyday as more likely to distort than to reveal, uncover the reality of the past. They argue that the way we write about the everyday distorts that everyday rather than reveals it. So, for example, a sociologist called Ben Highmore, this is his book, Everyday Life and Cultural Theory, Ben Highmore says that his objective is to write against the idea of the everyday as repetition. He says we must write against the idea of the everyday as routine. He wants to focus on the everyday as mystery. He argues that rather than dismiss ideology, rather than dismiss belief as a false consciousness, as many archaeologists still do, he stresses the fact that ideology, belief, describes a real lived actuality. He argues that ideology has to be seen as a profound actuality. It's how it was for those people at that time. Whether it's false consciousness or not, what they believed was real for them. And we have to get to that. He says that the sociological tradition in which he works is one which attempts to register the everyday as the marvelous and the extraordinary. Or at least he says he tries to combine dialectically the everyday as both extraordinary and tedious. Similarly, he says, if it is more normal to associate the everyday with the self-evident and the taken for granted, this tradition, his tradition, stresses the opacity of the everyday, stresses the fact that it's very difficult actually to understand the everyday. So the everyday is not taken for granted. The everyday is actually very difficult to get to. He questions what he calls the transparency of the daily. He questions the idea that the everyday is immediately knowable. So in sociology, there's a demand that we think about the everyday as mysterious. We think about the everyday as difficult to understand, not as something that we can immediately know. Alongside these developments in theory, and there are many anthropological discussions of this as well, historians and anthropologists have begun to argue that we will fundamentally misunderstand everyday life if we don't recognize that the senses, the ways in which people apprehended, the ways in which people interacted with the world around them every day, have a history. Chris Woolgar, and this is his new book, The Senses in Late Medieval England, he says, he makes the position very clear. He says, daily life, everyday life in the past cannot be understood without first understanding how perception functioned. In other words, how people saw the past, what they understood about smell, about hearing, about touch. He said, we need to understand that before we can understand everyday life in the past. He says, it is impossible to overstate the significance of sensory perception in understanding how medieval people behaved in their daily lives. So we can reconstruct subsistence, we can reconstruct exchange patterns, but unless we know how they perceived the world, we will misunderstand the early Middle Ages or the later Middle Ages or any Middle Ages. In the same way, very sadly late, Michael Camille, the art historian, he says that we must be aware that vision has a history. We must be aware that people saw things differently in the past. They heard things differently in the past. They smelled things differently in the past. We must be aware, he says, that vision has a history. We need, he says, to locate vision in a particular time and a particular place. You need to understand how people saw things historically, not assume they saw things like us. So what these anthropologists, the sociologists, and historians are arguing, or demanding, they're arguing that we reconstruct new archaeologies of the everyday. Archaeologies that reject the separation between ritual and the everyday. Archaeologies that go beyond the mundane to see everyday life as also permeated by the marvelous, by the miraculous. And archaeologies that understand that, archaeologies that apprehend the everyday as people in the past did, in all its strangeness, in all its variety, and in all its difference. So we shouldn't assume that the everyday in the past was like ours. We should try and find out what theirs was like, how they really perceived it, and how they really understood it. Okay, to take this agenda forward, in Sheffield, we have organized a little conference in June this year, called Archaeologies of the Everyday. And the conference is organized around 5 different themes, and the themes are, you probably can't read this, so I'll read them out. The themes are the historicity of the senses, the senses as history. And I'll talk about this more in a second. One other theme is the body in everyday life. And we have this theme because there's a lot of good work, both in Italy and in England, on how the body was seen, how the body was perceived in the Middle Ages, and especially on the idea that the natural and the supernatural world especially, had an influence on the way the body functioned. Another theme is everyday life versus ritual. And I have mentioned this several times already, this opposition, this presumed opposition between everyday life and ritual life. And what I'm going to show in the second part of the lecture, the talk, is that in fact there are some scholars now producing very significant insights into the way belief was structured through monuments, into the way in which belief was structured through ritual and liturgy. At the same time as that, and I'll conclude with this, there's also some very significant work going on which shows how ritual structured the everyday life of people. It structured their settlements, it structured the way they lived and the way they behaved. And I'll consider those in more detail. So for the rest of the talk, what I want to do is to focus on 2 of the themes and think about how we can use them to think afresh about everyday life in the Middle Ages. And the 2 themes I want to look at are the historicity of the senses, about vision, and then also about the opposition between everyday life and ritual life. Okay, so I'm going to focus looking at the senses, the historicity of the senses. I'm going to look at vision, but others have written about smell, about hearing, about taste, whatever. And I'm going to focus on my work at Bradbourne because I know this very well. So vision and the Bradbourne Cross. Okay, this monument, which I showed at the very start, it now stands in the grounds of the parish church of Bradbourne. It's all that remains of a cross, a freestanding stone cross, which was erected first in the late 8th or early 9th centuries. It's a fantastic monument. It's got a fantastic history. I've reconstructed the history of the monument from the 8th century to the early 20th century in all its different histories. It's got many histories over this time. The monument, the cross, and I'll show you what it looked like in a second, the cross stood as a monument of very great significance in the village until it was destroyed, until it was reduced to fragments in a bout of iconoclasm at some point in the late 16th or early 17th centuries. This is the Reformation. So as a product of the Reformation in England, this monument was destroyed. The fact that it was destroyed tells us about the power of that monument in the lives of the villagers, because the people who destroyed it recognized that it had power, and that's why they destroyed it. So the fact of destruction tells us about its power in the lives of the people of the village. What I'm interested in here is how those people saw this monument, how they would have seen the cross, what it meant for them every day. How did this monument structure their everyday lives? To do that, we have to do two things. We have to understand what the monument looked like. Sorry, we have to understand what the monument looked like at any particular point in time, and then we have to understand how they saw it, how the people in the Middle Ages understood the monument. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I will situate the everyday as the late 13th, early 14th centuries. So I'll try to understand how people in the late 13th century understood this monument. One could do the same for the 8th century or the 9th century. I take the late 13th century because this is the date of the long house that we excavated. I want to understand how the people who lived in that house saw this monument, this cross. Okay. So that's the everyday that I look at. More difficult is to understand what the cross looked like in the late 13th or early 14th centuries. It's very clear that this was a cross. And this is, some people have argued that it was never a cross, but it is clear that it was a cross. This is a similar monument from a nearby village, and there's a break here, but the cross head is on top. And in our excavations at Bradbourne, we found this fragment from our cross, and so we know it had a cross head just like this, and so we're very sure it was a cross. This is very significant because we know from a lot of work by historians that the cross was one of the most significant images in the Middle Ages. In England, perhaps in Italy too, I don't know, but in England, the crucifix, the cross, the symbol of Christ's passion, the symbol of Christ's death, the symbol of the promise of judgment, the promise of salvation, the cross. And this is a quote from Eamon Duffy. He's a very famous English historian of the later Middle Ages. He tells us that the crucifix, the cross, dominated late medieval English sensibilities as no other image did. Every parish church in England was focused upon the cross, not only in crucifixion panels in wood, paint, or alabaster, but also on great carved roods. Roods is an Old English word for cross. So the great carved crosses dominated English churches. These roods had an image of the crucifixion with an image of the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist on either side of the cross. These crosses divided the chancel from the nave of the churches. Crosses and crucifixes, he says, dominated every graveyard. They flanked the highways. They were littered throughout the landscape of late medieval England. He concludes that the late medieval world was dominated, was suffused with the sign of the cross. Now, to read that monument, to read these crosses as they would have been read in the 14th century, we have to understand that this was a world in which the devil, the agents of Satan, were an ever-present reality. Here are some agents of Satan, some demons. These are early 16th century demons. But in this world, people believed that these demons really existed. They believed, and these are quotes from 15th century texts, they believed that demons flew full of lightness and power, as thick as motes in the sun, in the air above the earth. And they believed that the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, high up in the air, was the most significant force in the battle against the demons. So in this context, the cross in the churchyard at Bradbourne is not just a memorial to a saint. It's not just a memorial to where a saint may have died. It is, in fact, a very active weapon in securing the existence of the parish. The cross was the weapon with which the parish fought the demons. So therefore, the cross is fundamental for them to the existence of the parish. And therefore, to their everyday life. This is what they believed. To fully appreciate the significance of the cross, this cross, on everyday life in the parish, we have to think again about what it looked like. The Bradbourne cross that we have today is not one that medieval parishioners would have recognized. They would not recognize that as the cross that they knew. Michael Camille, again, the art historian, he points out that monuments like the Bradbourne cross are not, he says, finished objects. He says, in fact, they are receptacles for other objects. To begin with, he says, these crosses would have been polychromed. I'll show you in a second. They would have been painted, very, very lavishly painted. They also would have been decorated with jewelry, with bronze crowns, with eyes set into them. Richard Bailey, another historian of art of this period, he says, and this is our reconstruction of what the Bradbourne cross would have looked like when complete. He says, far from being tastefully reticent, appearing as natural stone, the carvings on these crosses would have been garishly painted. Their surface often overlaid with gesso, often peppered with glass, with paste, with metalwork attachments. What we see today, he says, is merely the first stage in preparing a finished product. What we see today was never meant to be seen. So when people in the Middle Ages saw the cross, they didn't see what we see. They saw this. When you see this, and when you understand how vision worked in the Middle Ages, the relationship between you and the monument is very different every day. This is, I must say, this is not my work. This is the work of one of my students who reconstructed the cross and did a virtual reality imaging of the cross. So you can, on my website, you can go in and see the cross move around and lots of things. The late medieval reader of this cross would have been confronted with a multicolored, multi-textured monument on which the crucified Christ, wearing a gilded bronze crown, stared out of glass eyes. I'll show you later the eyes that were on the cross. Christ stared out of glass eyes. Above the cross would have been a red sun and a blue moon, while below the cross, the features of the soldiers Longinus and Stephaton, they would have been colored. They would have been painted clearly. The same glass eyes, the same painted features, the same dress would have embellished the other figures on the cross. Some of whom carried texts, appropriate texts, would have been painted onto the cross as well. Now to us, this image looks closer to the kind of statuettes, the gaudy statuettes sold to tourists outside the Vatican. But Michael Camille says the importance of this painted detail cannot be underestimated because the colors were significant, the decoration was significant, the whole features of the cross were significant. And what is critical is not our perception of this as not very beautiful, but what is significant is how people in the Middle Ages actually saw it. So how did they see the images? In the 14th century, the Bradbourne cross would have been one of many, many images that dominated the parish, or the lives of the parishioners. The late Middle Ages in England witnessed what historians call an image explosion. Their images dominated everywhere. Now, Michael Camille tries to understand this image explosion by arguing that in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, people began to see images differently. They understood images differently. They understood that images had a power in their lives which they don't today. What he does, he suggests that we must replace our notion of lifelikeness as photographic realism. We must replace that, he says, with an understanding in which these images seem to live, they seem to move, and they seem to breathe. And he argues that the doctrine of transubstantiation introduced in the 13th century, the church doctrine which argued that Christ is really present in the Eucharist, he said this was extremely significant in how people read images. Because, and here we have Christ in the Eucharist being really present, just here. He argues that with this doctrine of transubstantiation, here a visible thing was capable of becoming, not just representing its prototype. The thing could become what the prototype. The kneeling person here at the Eucharist sees not an image, but Christ himself. Once this has happened, he argues, the way lies open for images to behave in ways that break down the barriers between representation and reality, between image and prototype. The image can become the thing that it represents. And when that happens, the whole perception of images changes totally. So this is the context, I think, in which we have to understand the cross at Bradbourne. This is not a simple memorial. It's not a simple sign of Christ's death and passion. It is, in fact, an eruption of the marvelous, of the miraculous, into the world of the everyday. Finally, we also have to understand how vision functioned at this time. And there's been a lot of historical work on how vision functioned in the Middle Ages, because what we need to know is that the relationship between the object, the eye, and the brain was different in the Middle Ages from what it is today. Quoting again from Michael Camille, he says, we think of vision in passive terms. We think of vision as the reflection of inverted images upon the retina. He argues instead that medieval people saw vision as supremely active. Whether they were scholastic philosophers making diagrams of light rays in optical treatises, or farmers worried about their cows being bewitched by the evil eye, he says sight was a potent force. Images of things then were far more powerful than they are today. There were at least two theories of vision in the Middle Ages: extramission and intramission. These theories of vision ultimately come from the Greeks via the Romans, and they end up being propagated in the Middle Ages in two different forms: extramission and intramission. Both of these theories of vision assumed that vision was tactile, that it worked by touching the object. So in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, we have a theory in which the eye was seen like a lamp. The eye was seen to emit rays. Rays went out of the eye to the object. And that was how the eye worked. St. Augustine believed that the rays that came out of the eyes, I quote, he believed that the ray was constituted from a kind of fire that gathered behind the pupil and was brought back to the eye, light or fire from the object. So rays shot out and prehended the object and brought it back to the eye. So they saw the eye as a lamp. The problem with this theory was that it didn't really explain why people couldn't see in the dark. Because if the eye was a lamp, then you should be able to see in the dark, but it didn't work. In the later Middle Ages, from the 12th century onwards, this theory of vision was replaced by intramission. And this basically reversed the argument. Here, the image, not the eye, sent forth rays. So in the Middle Ages, I would believe that you are sending rays to me, and my eye is picking up the rays that you send out to me. The rays were also called species. and these were sent out by you towards me, and I picked them up. The object itself emitted species into the air, which were then carried to the eye in straight lines or rays. And the capacity of the eye to receive these rays was made evident in paintings, where you have images, as here, of people experiencing visions, where you have the rays flowing from the divine object into the eyes of St. Bridget in this case. This is a early 15th century painting showing the rays in operation. Now we know today that this is a profoundly flawed vision of how, a profoundly flawed understanding of how vision worked. The point is that this is what people in the Middle Ages believed. This is how they understood the eye to work. And the dynamic nature of the relationship between the eye and the object meant that the visible object, the object itself, was able to assimilate the eye and the soul to its nature and essence. There was a very tangible contact and change. This was a tactile sense in the Middle Ages. Species or rays entering the body, entering the soul via the eye, could literally impress an object on the soul. So it becomes very dangerous. This theory of vision allows objects to enter the soul via the eye. And there were, from this, unimaginable consequences. Because of this capacity of the object to enter the soul via the eye, it was very important that people see the right things, because otherwise memory and imagination could be contaminated. There was a possibility of what they call visual contagion, of people being affected, deeply damaged by what they saw. And this, Camille tells us, accounts for why pregnant women were not encouraged to look on any very disgusting animal, lest they give birth to children of similar appearances. And also why the historian and naturalist Gerald of Wales, he could cite authorities that he had read, which described a queen who had a painting of a Negro in her bedroom, and she spent so much time staring at this painting of this Negro in her bedroom that the result was that she had a black baby. Now, there may have been other reasons why she had a black baby, but this is the explanation that Gerald of Wales gives, that she looked at this painting, the painting entered her body through her eyes, impressed itself on her fetus, and the baby was black. So for people in the Middle Ages, this possibility of visual contagion was real and very dangerous. So the reality of the power of images to affect the mind, the soul, and therefore the salvation of medieval people adds to their power, adds to the power that they had in the world. These images were really active. And finally, I want to come back to the Bradbourne cross, because the cross itself would have been, as I said, very heavily decorated with other objects. The sun and the moon here would have been painted, as I said, all of it would have been painted. But I don't know if you can see, but in the faces of the soldiers who are piercing Christ's side, there are little eye holes. These would have contained little glass eyes, which would have stared out. And we have some existing examples of this at a place called Wirksworth, very close by. So it's a very regional tradition of putting glass eyes into it. Christ, I can't see up there. Christ would have had a gilded crown as well, but the significant thing are the glass eyes that these people would have had, the images would have had on the cross. They would have had a glaring, kind of all-encompassing aspect. So on the one hand, the cross was a manifestation of the supernatural in the everyday. And I wonder how the parishioners of Bradbourne felt about being caught up in the kind of heavenly species, because if you remember that these images could become the supernatural. And therefore, how do they feel about being caught up in the heavenly species that were emitted by the rays on the cross? On the other hand, contemplation of the cross, looking at the cross, thinking about it, thinking about the images on the cross, would have impressed the symbol of salvation onto their minds and onto their souls, and therefore protecting them from the forces which threatened the parish. This was everyday life in the parish at Bradbourne. This cross, this kind of monument, was a very significant force in the everyday life of the inhabitants of the Longhouse that we excavated several years ago. This kind of everyday life is one that is radically different from that which we have constructed up until now. Our everyday life until now is dominated by subsistence, by exchange, blah, blah, whatever. Now we need to think about ritual, we need to think about belief, we need to think about the power of images in the lives of these individuals.